welcome back to Kelly and Phoebe Go to the Movies, except we're going to the movies at home because we're doing this over Zoom. So this week we're talking about Up from the Streets, New Orleans, the City of Music. First of all, I love that name because it
Yeah.
has two colons in it, and that's very unusual, and I really like that. So, Kelly, I would love to hear your thoughts first.
Well, I think your description of the title itself kind of says something about the film. I mean, it's the main title and then a subtitle that also has a colon. Um, and
Yeah.
that's how I felt about the film a little bit. It's a good metaphor for the film itself. Was just it was really expansive. It was I mean the whole history of jazz and the whole history of New Orleans like crammed into a 1.5 hour movie. So by turns felt totally overwhelming, like the amount of information you got. But I think by the end, like I felt overwhelmed a few times during the movie, but by the end, I just was like, wow, I learned a tremendous amount of information. That's really cool. Um,
Yeah. I think that's a
yes.
really good way to put it, is overwhelmed for a bit of it because yeah, and I think I had the same experience where like throughout it I was like, okay, I can't keep track of all these names. There's so many different people, there's so many different things that have affected the music and like the way that it's developed. And then by the end, I was like, "Oh, I actually remember a lot of, I was looking at IMDb and seeing all the names that they had mentioned, and I was like, oh, there's like I see how it all connects. I see the way that
Hmm.
what I learned throughout this movie. So I actually, in the end, I think
Yeah.
it really worked.
Yeah, while not watching the movie, I kept being like, you are covering too much ground. Like, pick from the 50s forward, pick, a time period, pick something and like do a deep dive. Was like kind of how I felt throughout the movie. But yeah, once I got to the end, it was just like, wow, that was like actually a really nice. I don't know that I understand jazz at a super profound level, but to see the whole history laid out and the whole um, yeah, just all the influences and everything. It was a really nice intro. I think,
Yeah.
especially for me, jazz is not the music form that I'm most familiar with. And I mean, I'm familiar with it. I've
Mhm.
listened to it. I'm a pianist myself, Exhibit A. And so I grew up playing a lot of different types of music. I've personally gravitated a lot more towards classical or like Broadway musical theater than I did jazz. It's just what resonated with me. So I haven't listened to a lot of jazz. I don't know the history. So I would imagine somebody who really knows jazz, this primer, it was more of a primer, right? Of like,
Mhm.
maybe you don't know much about jazz, maybe you don't know much about New Orleans, but here's all of it. So I would imagine if you are really a big jazz fan, it's maybe a little flyover.
Yeah.
Um, Whereas for me, not knowing a lot of jazz, I was like, wow, this is fascinating. It's so cool about this art form. And like, in particular, the performances. I loved watching the performances. As a
Yes.
musician myself, it was just, I love watching people play music. And it was just so joyful and exuberant and beautiful and fun. And it was shot in such a lovely way. So I really enjoyed that aspect.
Yeah. Something that this one did differently, I think, was that most of it was spent with music playing, and you could almost like, I mean, to be honest, at some points I did zone out a bit and just like let the music play because it would play for like a significant period of time before somebody
Yeah.
came back in and spoke. And I
Yeah.
really, really liked that, in a music documentary, you want music to be going along with the movie and the explanations of the music. So I think that it was done really well in just playing like large segments and having like re-recorded music by different people who were covering other people. I think they did a lot of music, and I think it was really
Yeah.
well done.
Yeah, and I liked especially how it rooted it in history and how jazz responded to what was going on in New Orleans and how it influenced New Orleans. It was this lovely kind of the city inspired the music and the music inspired the city and back and
Yeah.
forth and just even the rise of jazz being from New Orleans' unique history of slaves didn't have to work on Sundays, and so they did
Yeah.
music, and that's why we have jazz today. And I think
Yeah.
then also rooting it, especially in this current moment, it was a helpful thing to watch where it rooted the music into, Louis Armstrong. I really especially liked when they talked about Louis Armstrong and like this thin line that he walked as a Black superstar in an era where Jim Crow was still alive and well, and all of the different ways he had to present himself and how hard it was um, was
Right.
was really helpful and interesting, and heartbreaking, and you know just a lot of feels,
Yeah.
yeah, about that. And then also
And there was an interesting part where they mentioned that he had changed a lyric to be more explicitly like, "Hey, pay attention to this horrible travesty that's going on,"
yeah,
and nobody noticed at the time. And I thought that was
yeah,
really, really interesting.
right. And I thought, yeah, like what kind of power he had and how he chose to leverage it. And then, talking about the music of the civil rights movement and how that tied directly back into New Orleans history, and how
Right, with
how
Mahalia
it's
Jackson. Yeah,
yeah, and so that was really neat. I also appreciated that it talked about a lot of female jazz musicians, because I feel like when I think of jazz, I
definitely.
think about a lot of old dudes. And so it was
Yeah,
really fun to see how much it highlighted female singers and the role of women in creating jazz, and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, yeah, and the influences of like Aretha Franklin, and it was just I loved how it talked about how it just felt like this wonderful interweaving of this influenced that, and that gave rise to this and this, and even how jazz influenced hip hop, and like just all of it. And these were the steps that got us to hip hop from jazz, and so it was just, I thought it was a
right.
really cool documentary in that way, because like I said, it was huge and it was broad, and it felt like, let us tell you everything about jazz ever sometimes. But
Yeah.
then by the end, you felt like, wow, I really understand a lot of things.
And you mentioned the connection. It connects to hip hop in modern day. It also connected to to Katrina and the hurricane that happened, and how like the silence of the aftermath of that tragedy was really deafening to people who were from that area, because they were so used to music being constant. And I thought that was
Mm-hmm.
another really interesting tie-in, because they did,
Yeah.
I mean, they were trying to do a lot in this movie, and I mean, I think they did accomplish a lot.
Yeah.
But I do think you were right that it's definitely more of a like gloss over a massive thing that could have probably been like a 10-hour documentary, but
Right.
they were able to compress it into a really well segmented movie.
Yeah. Yeah. The part I could have done without was there was at about an hour and 15 in, it felt like it just dove deep into a bunch of different jazz figures from more recent decades, and I was just like, whoa, this has gone from a whole history and all this influences to really deep dives on single musicians.
Yeah, I think that was the part where I kind of zoned out and was just listening to the music.
Yeah, and I think that's the part where I started feeling a little overwhelmed. It was like, whoa, now we're gonna go deep dive into all of these people.
But then it came
So,
back pretty quickly
yeah,
with the hip hop and explaining how they're connected to each other, which I thought was a
yeah.
really interesting explanation.
Yeah, and it was neat, and I learned a lot about songs that I knew. I mean, I really didn't know Blackbird was about the civil rights movement
I
from the
didn't
Beatles. That
either.
just blew me away. And then the performance that they did of that song, I was weeping by the end of that, because like now knowing the
Yeah.
history and then listening to the performance that they did was really. There were a few moments like that too, of just like, I've heard this song before and I've never thought about it in this context. And now that I have, wow.
Right.
So I thought that was really neat too. Was just even some of the staples that we all know from jazz, R&B, rock and roll, all of that. It gave some new light on songs that I already loved. So that was really cool.
Right, yeah. Being able to put it in a context, in a historical context and a cultural context was definitely one of this movie's like coolest aspects, I
Hmm.
thought.
Yeah. So yeah, it was fun. And I also liked how it talks about kind of the lineages in jazz. Like I didn't realize that like there are so many like father sons, like famous fathers, and then their sons become musicians and they're famous musicians in their own right. And I guess I hadn't
Right.
learned much about that. And that was really cool how they talked about New Orleans feeling like a family and then lineages of jazz and like that kind of stuff. So I mean, it makes total sense. And I loved the part where the guy who's kind of the narrator, who's also the producer of the film, is like walking through the
Right.
streets and saying, you know, and I feel a connection because I'll walk by and hear a new musician. I won't know his name, but I can hear Louis Armstrong while he's playing. And I
And
just
he
thought
might
that
not
was,
even know that he's been influenced by Louis Armstrong was something that he
yeah,
mentioned too, which I
yeah.
thought
But
was
I just thought
interesting.
that was like so beautiful. It's like I hear Louis Armstrong and this young man I walk past on the street, and that
Yeah.
already makes me feel connected to him. There was just a lot of that kind of love and family and that kind of feel to the movie, which felt warm and fuzzy and lovely.
Definitely. Yeah. And it really made me want to visit New Orleans.
Right.
I mean, just the way they talk about how there's just music all the time. Everybody's wanting to dance every time they hear a trumpet start. It sounds fantastic.
Yeah, I know. So yeah, I thought it was just when we set out to watch this, I was just like, I don't really know much about jazz, and I don't really like jazz. I'm not sure about this movie. And by the end, I was just like, that was really fun, and I learned a lot, and it was really sweet and eye opening and heartbreaking, and yeah, it was a fun thing. I'm glad I watched it. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you had to give this one a rating out of five, I know documentaries are hard with ratings, but if you had to give this one 1 to 5 stars, what would you give it?
I think I'd do 3.5.
Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it. But I think after watching it, I simultaneously was like, wow, I learned so much, and wow, that was so surface level. So I think I'm actually deducting points that it's not like a docu series. Like I want it
Right.
to be like 4 or 5 episodes that are about an hour long rather than a hour and a half movie. So I guess that would be why I deduct the points is I think it actually left me wanting more and feeling like a lot was left out. And so I would like to see it as a longer form, multi episode series rather than an hour and a half movie that was just like, we're going to do the whole history at once. Boom.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think that was my one critique is it just whipped through stuff really fast and a little bit assumed you knew everybody that they were talking about.
It definitely did.
And I
Yeah.
think that was the other thing that I was like, this is clearly made for somebody who loves jazz because they're saying names like I should know them, and I don't know them because jazz is not really the music I listen to. So yeah, so I think that was the one thing was I was like, like so I did a lot of googling throughout the movie and that kind of thing. And I'm so glad I put in the effort, right? I was like, I'm
Right.
so glad. But yeah, it was just there were a couple things like that were just like I didn't just these things made it a little harder to watch or it made it more work or whatever.
Hmm.
But yeah, in the end, really glad I watched it. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah. For me, I would probably give it around a 3, just because even though I feel like it did way more music than a lot of the music documentaries that I've seen, it still felt very formulaic as far as a music documentary. So, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you. I think if this had been a series where they could focus more heavily on each person that they talk about, that I think could have been
Yeah.
a really good
Or like even
series.
some of the people they interviewed, like it was like and now Keith Richards. And it's like, well, okay, but
Yeah.
he's not a
How
jazz
is he
musician. Why
related?
is he
Yeah.
talking about jazz? And
And then you find
eventually
out,
you
yeah.
find out why, but there's just like no context. It's just like, now Keith Richards is going to talk about jazz for a while. And you're like, why? um,
Yeah.
so, so there were a few moments like that were a little like, if you had given me the context first, I wouldn't have spent all this time being confused before you gave me the context. So,
Yeah, and kind of
um,
a small thing is I noticed that for most of their like the titles that they were that put under the people who were being interviewed, it didn't say like anything about them. It just said their name. And I
right.
guess that's where the expectation that you just know these people comes in.
Yeah.
But I think some of them were probably like music theory kind of people. I don't know if they were all musicians. Maybe they all were. I didn't
Yeah.
recognize some of them though.
Yeah. Some of it was like by the end of the documentary, I'm like, oh, I get it. She's a jazz singer.
Right.
But you didn't give me that context at first. So it was just a woman telling me about jazz for a while. Um,
Yeah.
which, I mean, didn't really nullify, like, she seems very expert in this field and she has lots of interesting things to say. But then it was like, oh, she's actually a very famous jazz singer. Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah, and it
Um,
could have been a purposeful choice that they wanted to
yeah.
kind of like, you know, let you get to know them and then bring in their context within this. But there were some people that I don't think that they ever really explained their
Yeah.
context, and maybe that you were just expected to know who they were.
Yeah. And
So,
if you were pretty obscure, like I understand some of the musicians that maybe I don't know because I don't listen to a lot of jazz.
mhm.
Okay, that's on me for not knowing who they are. But some of them, it was like when I looked them up, it was like, oh, they're music producers, or that's somebody who's mixed a lot of famous albums. I'm like, why would
Got
I
it.
know that?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
so yeah, it was. I think that was the weakness. Was just it was throwing a lot of people at you with absolutely no context, and you kind of had to discern like who is this person and why. You know, like you could normally tell from what they were talking about, kind of where they intersected with jazz, but like even a like
Right.
music producer under their name or something would be helpful to because
Yeah, just that small change I think would have really
yeah.
helped me like understand who everyone was.
Yeah, because
Cuz,
there were a few
you
times
know,
I'm like, is this a musician? Is this a producer? Is this somebody I should know? Or is this a behind the scenes, or um,
right.
yeah, yeah. So
But
no, it's like overall the film was great. And I
mhm.
really enjoyed it and I learned so much and I'm so glad I've learned more because now that I've learned a lot more, it's like I'm actually really excited to listen to more jazz. And they actually released a playlist with the movie. So I've
Oh,
got a place to
nice.
start.
Oh, I've got to
Um,
find that. 'Cause
yeah, we have it on the page on our website
awesome.
that is linking to the film. So, but yeah, so it was just like I'm so excited to be learning more about jazz. It was really fun. But yeah, the documentary was a little more work than I think sometimes. Sometimes you want the documentary to like explain
Help you.
everything, and that's
Yeah,
where
give
I'm
you.
not sure who the audience for this documentary is. Was it people like me who don't know much about jazz because then I needed a lot more context, or is
Mhm.
it for people who already love jazz and they're trying to build this narrative, in which case it felt a little like, wouldn't somebody who knows jazz know a lot of this stuff? So
Yeah.
anyway, but yeah, I think my bottom line is I really learned a lot and I'm glad I did because it's yeah, I learned a lot about people and a genre of music that I just don't know a lot about, and that was really cool. And
Right.
that's what documentaries should do, right? Is like introduce you to a topic that you can kind of fall in love with and explore more. So yeah,
Yeah, so if you want a good primer and to hear a lot of great music throughout this movie, this is a good documentary for
yeah,
that.
totally.
Um, so yeah, great talking to you, Kelly.
Yeah,
Thank you
you
as
too.
always, and we'll talk next time.
Alrighty, bye everybody.